What are some of the creepiest mental conditions you've ever encountered? A lot of people know about phantom limb syndrome, in which someone continues to feel as if their limb is still there after it's been amputated, often in great pain. Another interesting one that not many people know about, and is almost kind of an opposite, is body integrity identity disorder, which is when a person has extremely strong feelings that one or more of their limbs doesn't belong to them, despite being functional, and often they really want to amputate. From their descriptions, it seems that it's actually very psychologically painful, sometimes to the point where they will self-amputate because no doctor is willing to amputate a healthy limb. I once read a short, fictional story where the narrator is talking about the terrifying, deformed growths on his hands and is frustrated that everyone is downplaying his worries and pretending he's normal. Eventually, by the end, he decides to deal with it himself, and he uses power tools to remove all 10 of the disgusting growths. This sounds slightly like what I experienced a lot going through puberty. I felt as though my member wasn't actually mine. I had thoughts constantly about wanting to try and get rid of it with a pair of gardening shears, but I could never actually build up the willpower to do it. I never felt actual physical pain from it, but I remember lying in bed at night in emotional and mental pain, trying to figure out why I was so uncomfortable with myself. Eventually, by the end of my sophomore year of high school, I was able to accept that even though it may seem like it isn't an actual part of me, in reality, my member was mine, no one else's, and that's how it had to be. This was only accomplished by losing my virginity. I've never heard of anything more psychologically incredible than a fugue state, when the mind can't deal with reality, so it just creates an entirely new world for itself to live in. Or you just need time to deal with Tuco. A friend of mine is suffering the Capgras delusion. We moved apart several years ago and hadn't been in touch very well. I know she had gone through some stressful times. I had a couple of phone calls with her where she was worried that her computer had been hacked, but she seemed reasonable. Then one day she called me and told me that her husband had been replaced with an imposter. She wanted me to fly to visit her so I could see him with my own eyes and confirm for her that it wasn't really him. Talking to her is simultaneously fascinating, unnerving, and heartbreaking. The worst part is, while she's clearly not correct in her beliefs, she is quite consistent in them, and they are utterly real in her mind. Imagine how freaking terrified you would be all the time if you were certain that the most important person in your life was a stranger with mysterious, nefarious motivations. Imagine going to bed every night next to someone you thought was out to get you. Imagine spending all day desperately trying to find your husband because he must be out there somewhere, right? Oh my gosh, imagine being the husband. I did talk to him for a while. He was unbelievably stressed out. He was doing everything he could for her. Meanwhile, she treated him like a stranger. That is a rough deal. In some ways, I can't think whether this or a terminal illness is worse for someone's family when it happens. I was in a psych ward for depression, and my roommate was terrifying. She was schizophrenic, depressed, and also probably just kind of weird. She punched herself in the face constantly while whispering to the voices in her head. She also used to sit in the multi-purpose TV room, TV, games, fridge, etc., on the floor and flicked the bean. Like, a lot. But she never stopped whispering to herself while she did it. I woke up to tinkle one night and she was just in her bed, staring blankly at me. She was moved to a long-term facility on my third day there. Oh god, I had a similar experience with my roommate. He was this really big guy, very nice and well-mannered. He'd tell us and the doctors during group therapy about how his mother didn't care about him. He told sob stories like many people there did, and it was sad but not unusual. Then one day, one of the doctors mentioned something about a certain medication he was taking, and I recognized it as an antipsychotic. It turns out he was a paranoid schizophrenic, and it just terrified me when I put the pieces together. And then I overheard his mother sobbing as she left from a visit and his father trying to calm her down and reassure her that he doesn't know what he's saying, and it wasn't his fault. Reactive attachment disorder. I work at a group home for kids with this disorder, and it was creepy before I fully understood it. Children who've been severely mistreated or neglected early in life often have their ability to form healthy attachments to caregivers or anyone destroyed. Some of them would cling to me, call me mummy, beg to come home with me 30 seconds after I met them. Others would refuse to talk to anyone, hurt themselves and others, set fires and act out any chance they could. Sometimes they would improve only enough to be sent to foster homes, only to have their behavior come back worse once they were placed in an unstructured family setting. It's extremely tragic. I had, or have, I guess, this disorder. I've grown out of the destructive episodes and bullying, but I still don't really have any relationships with people outside of my work or family. It's scary to look back on it now because I could have wound up in adult prison, but I used to lay awake at night and think about how I could manipulate the staff at my group home into killing each other. They were like Iago-level schemes. I figured out who was screwing who already didn't like each other, etc. I was even worse in foster homes. I bullied other kids for money and stuff, ran away constantly, stole everything I could get away with. I stabbed an adult in the leg when I was 10 because he called me a craphead, which admittedly was accurate. I also tried to do the deed with all of my foster moms and pretty much every other adult woman in my life. There are so few reliable long-term studies on RAD. Existing research suggests kids do grow out of it to the point where they no longer fit the diagnostic criteria as adults, but it still impacts their relationships. This is one of the reasons I think it's wrong to even suggest a child has antisocial personality disorder before age 18. Once you have that label, it sticks, and if a kid thinks they're born bad, they're more likely to act that out. I'm really sorry for what happened to you. It's not your fault, it's a normal reaction to the abnormal situation you're put in. I spent some time in the group homes and foster care myself, and it's what caused me to study psychology and social work. You're already ahead of the game by being so self-aware, so please don't give up continuing to heal. Oh, I have one. Now, nobody's been diagnosed with this in 40-odd years or so, but it's still taught in most undergrad courses because it's a really good example of culture-specific disorder. It's called Wendigo psychosis, or Wendigo, Wetico, or Wintico, and here's how it goes down. You're a young male in an Algonquin tribe. It's been a long, cold winter and your whole tribe is starving. You and your hunting partner have been out hunting for moose or deer or even a bear if you have to, but you've totally struck out. You're starving, he's starving, and you've seen the way he's starting to look at you over the fire at night. So you do what you have to do before he does. You kill him and eat him. You know what happens when you eat another man, but you're starving and it's cannibalize or die. So you eat him, and the Wendigo comes and possesses you, because the Wendigo possesses everyone who eats someone else. And now that the Wendigo has possessed you, you're hungrier than you were. Hungrier than you've ever been before. But the only thing you're hungry for is more people. So you go back to your tribe and one of two things happens. One, you tell someone and they attempt to cure you by having you eat melted bear fat until you vomit the heart of ice you now have because you're a Wendigo demon. 35% of reported cases were cured by this method. Or two, you don't tell anyone. You go back to your tribe and attempt to kill and eat a family member. You'll eventually be stopped and killed during your murderous and cannibalistic rampage, and your remaining families will burn your body and scatter the ashes to prevent the Wendigo from possessing them too. The other 65% of reported cases. In conclusion, Wendigo psychosis is when you think an Indian demon possesses you, and then you try to eat your family. Fatal familial insomnia is pretty freaking scary. Suddenly you just start not being able to fall asleep, and you're gone within 7 to 36 months. You gradually lose the ability, along with a number of other symptoms over time, until eventually, at the end of the last stage, you'll not have slept in a long time. You'll be hallucinating and suffering from dementia, and eventually, you'll die. Only 40 families, about 100 people, have the disorder. Also, if you have it, there's a good chance you'll have kids by its onset, making the disorder pass down even further. Scary stuff. Diseases caused by prions are really scary. Every one of them, and all fatal. This is one of the most fascinating things I've heard about, and a single gene is responsible. Split brain syndrome. Sometimes as a means of treating severe seizures or epilepsy, surgeons will sever the corpus callosum, the connecting tissue between the two lobes of the brain. The good news is that future full-blown seizures are limited to one half of the brain, leaving the patient aware and able to take precautionary measures. The bad news is that thanks to the lateralization of function, there are essentially two minds in the skull that can each only react to certain forms of stimuli. Patients usually develop workarounds, though. The weirdest part is the occasional outcome of alien hand syndrome, in which one of the brains takes control of one hand and uses it independently. When questions are presented to the controlling hemisphere, the hand can write out its answers, which is sometimes in disagreement with the main brain and the patient's spoken answers. It's been a while since I've studied abnormal psych, so the details might be a little fuzzy. This sounds like something we would ridicule in the future, like we do with some of the medical practices of the Middle Ages. Nurse here. First patient who thought she was the devil scared the crap out of me. You eventually get so used to people who think they're the devil and become numb to all the weird crap they do. This seems like the opposite of the scenario of multiple people with messiah complexes being kept together. What a perverse and, of course, tragic situation. I live with a longtime friend who I'm convinced is developing or has developed disorganized schizophrenia over the past 3 years. It's not as crazy or mind-blowing as some of the other ones in this group of stories, but it is truly messing up his life and making it exceptionally hard for me to tolerate him on a daily basis. More bizarre than anything. In the past couple of months, especially, he's exhibited extremely antisocial and disorganized behavior. Everything from inappropriate emotional reactions to regular life events, to an inability to form complete sentences or thoughts in a conversation, to plain old just messing around with people by not making any sense, sometimes on purpose, and sometimes unknowingly. He used to be an extremely personable guy who could just approach anyone and make friends. Now he literally can't hold a conversation, but he still wants to be really approachable and personable, but doesn't realize that he actually creeps people out so much that they will passionately avoid talking to him again. The most frustrating thing that he does is basically attaches to me whenever I'm at home. He'll stand at my bedroom door and watch me do my homework, fold my laundry, clean my room, work on my computer, build Legos, etc. He will always be in the same room as I am unless I've shut my bedroom door. He mimics my actions, wakes up whenever I do, goes to sleep whenever I do, always wants to cook or clean wherever I am. I essentially have to find things that he can't or doesn't know how to do to get some freedom. It's mostly me because I've known him for way longer than my roommates, but when I'm not home, he does all of this to them as well. I think this all stems from his inability to make basic decisions, like when to eat or where to study, or when to leave in order to be on time for something. This extends to almost every aspect of his life. I've been seeing a counselor to consult with her about it, but it's basically impossible to know anything for sure, because she can't tell me any information about him or his visits. He started going as well. I don't know if he goes to them unless I ask him, and there's no telling when he'll forget about a session or just decide not to go to the doctor's evaluation. It's even more frustrating that his counselor keeps telling me that I shouldn't keep reminding him of these things or keeping tabs on him, because eventually I will be like a mother taking care of an infant child. My words, not hers, and she is right, but it is upsetting. Weirdest part, he's studying behavioral neuroscience. In conclusion, I've been friends with my roommate for over a decade. In the past 3 years, he's developed disorganized schizophrenia right in front of my eyes, and there's nothing I can do about it. He's echoing, repeating your behaviors and actions as a way to cope. Some will do it in conversations as well, latching onto a phrase of importance and repeating it. The rain is really bad today. Yeah, the rain is bad. It's a sign of cognitive impairment. Your story is sad. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out easymode, also linked below, and subscribe. I'm a psych major, so not a professional, but in my opinion it is catatonic schizophrenia. Those suffering from this type of schizophrenia, although in the DSM-V they're getting rid of the different types of schizophrenia and there'll just be one classification, will sometimes be unable to speak or move. My professor worked in a clinic while in school and told us of one patient who would suddenly lock up into extremely awkward positions and not move for extended periods of time. This used to happen to a friend of mine. He passed away 3 years ago, and it was absolutely freaking terrifying. The first time it happened, we had no idea what to do, so we just called an ambulance. I'm sorry to hear that. I can't imagine how it would feel to witness something like that and have no way of explaining it before a diagnosis. Another scary part of mental illness is that more often than not, those who are suffering from the condition, whether it's schizophrenia or something else, will oftentimes not even notice it themselves. I spent a week in a mental ward. I had depression and I'd told a cop I wanted to take my own life in a fit of rage. The hospital I was at was divided. One side was Group A, folks who needed treatment but were considered safe. Group B was the folks that had to be watched more closely. About 2 days after I was checked in, another woman had come in too. She was also placed in Group A and was placed as my roommate. At first she seemed nice and normal-ish, but after a few hours her stories were getting mixed up. I mean, she came in, found out I had a kid, and then said she had a daughter as well, who lived with her mother-in-law, or something. After dinner, the story was that her daughter had been lost after being brutally murdered by her father, and that the woman didn't even care. I voiced my concerns to the nurses, but I was just told to go to bed in the same room with this lady. It took a while for me to fall asleep that night because my sleep schedule was all sorts of messed up. I think I passed out around midnight. We were put to bed at 8 p.m. I'm not sure how long I was asleep for before I was woken up by my roommate strangling me. Now, we were placed in the last room at the end of the hall, far from the nurse's desk. Plus, I was being strangled, so I couldn't even yell for help. I thought I was going to die, but I'd fallen asleep with a book. So I bashed the book on my roommate's head and booked it out of the room. The nurses probably thought I was the super crazy one yelling at them. I'm not sure they would have believed me if it wasn't for the fact that I had hand marks around my neck. My roommate was transferred to the other side of the ward, locked up with a limited time out of her room. I never bothered to ask what her deal was. I don't want to know. I had a new roommate by the end of the day, a really nice older lady who was a lesbian. I told her about crazy roommate number 1, and we would just shoot the crap for hours at night until I was ready to pass out. What reason is there to have roommates in a psych ward? It sounds like you're asking for trouble. Yeah, I thought so too, but everyone on the safe side had a roommate. Only had X amounts of rooms. If the second roommate never came, I would have been alone. Only us 2 chicks on that side the whole time I was there. It must be because of the money, because my friend had to go to an institution when he was a teenager and was thinking of taking his own life, and they didn't even let him talk to his roommate. It sounded like prison and it made him more depressed. He also had a 9-year-old roommate who'd attacked his mom. They made the kids go around and say why they were there every day in the group therapy, so every day everyone was reminded about what that kid did. My friend's mom took him out after a week. The big difference with these things lie with whether or not it's a place where the patients are there voluntarily. When I was checking myself into the psych ward last year, depression, wanting to hurt myself, my doctors told me not to go to the hospital that has non-voluntaries. That's where you're going to see the horrifying roommate stuff. Unfortunately, I would say a good number of people don't have a choice though. The scariest thing I know of is locked-in syndrome, where you're completely awake but unable to move. People assume you're a comatose vegetable when you're really just paralyzed, for decades. Not the same thing, but similar. My mom was having open-heart surgery when the anesthesia wore off, though she was still paralyzed, so she could feel everything. Apparently it didn't hurt too much, but was scary as frick. Happened 2 or 3 times, I think. There's an amazing film about this condition. It's called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. A true story about Jean-Dominique Barbie, who was the editor-in-chief of Elle magazine until he suffered a stroke that led to locked-in syndrome. The film was adapted from a book that he wrote using only one eyelid to communicate. That's a grim fate to be sure, although that's the norm in this story grouping. Your psych evaluations are just as important as your medical checkups, folks. I'm a paranoid schizophrenic. I don't believe there's anything scarier on the planet than an episode. Nothing is more terrifying than being betrayed by your own mind. The things you hear and see, it's awful. I'm a psychology major, but this story doesn't have to do with my schooling. To put myself through school, I worked as a receptionist at a swimming pool, and Thursday is the day when individuals with disabilities and mental disorders come to the pool with their workers. I was on the other side of the counter helping the individuals into the changing rooms, and one of the clients grabbed my hair and started screaming at me that it was too beautiful and she needed to take it. One of the single most upsetting moments of my life, because after her worker managed to get her to relinquish my hair, she just continued to scream wordlessly until I was no longer in her sight. Wife is a psychologist. She says shared delusional disorder. Woman and her mother had paranoid delusions about mum's ex-husband and were convinced he was stalking them and breaking into their house. The ex had gotten the woman's son, aged 6, a modeling contract, and they thought that every picture of a kid in a magazine was him. The images that didn't look like him, they claimed were photoshopped. This was so weird and creepy since 2 people shared the same delusions. Psychologist here, work specifically with kids with degenerative or developmental disorders, and in my day I have seen some crap. There is nothing creepier than something called happy puppet syndrome, aka angel man syndrome. It's a disease most commonly found in children where they always have a happy effect, even when they're upset. And to top it all off, their motor skills are affected in such a way that their limbs move as if they're on marionette strings. There's a condition where people believe that their life is like the Truman Show, and that nothing in their life is real. I think that's creepy because there's no way to convince them that they're not part of a TV show. Yeah, this happened with my ex-boyfriend. Not exactly that it was a TV show, but still thought everyone in the entire world was watching him. Really scary stuff. Happened to me on a bad substance trip. Didn't help that I blacked out and came to in the backseat of my car at sunset at the beach, not another soul in sight. For about 20 minutes, I thought I broke the illusion and now I was going to live forever in an empty simulation. Friends weren't answering my calls or anything. Way messed up. When I was younger, I was a pretty unstable kid, which led to multiple stays in a youth psych ward. One of the times I was in, we got a boy who looked like a 14-year-old fatter, paler, creepier Jack White. So we find out that he threatened to kill and eat his school principal, which even to a bunch of mentally ill teens, was psycho as frick. I felt bad for him because obviously he was messed up in the head, way more than us at least. But he would say all of these awkward things trying to be funny that ended up sounding like serial killer quotes like, "Do you ever wonder what it feels like to be dead or eat someone?" Which, especially to the girls, was freaky as F. So after my roommate gets out, I hear that this Hannibal Lecter wannabe is moving into my room. It's weird, but I just brush it off. I was 250 pounds and 5'10", and he was just him. And every once in a while when he made a messed up joke, they would just pull him aside and tell him to chill out. But one day I don't see him, and one of the doctors calls me in. They tell me he's in his own room in solitary now, and they pull out his notebooks and it's filled with drawings of me while I sleep. Fantasy drawings of him doing the deed with me, killing me, eating me, and pages of ramblings on how he would F me or how I would taste. It's literally the entire notebook front to back filled with these drawings and writings. I'm so petrified that I don't talk or leave my room for days. He apparently got sent to a long-term center far away, but I ended up staying even longer since they thought I would try to self-delete over that. But that's the story. Never saw or heard from him again. Still think about it all the time. It's hard to sleep around other people anymore. I was once in a party and joined this group of people, of which I knew just one person. He introduced me to the others one by one, and when I arrived at the last one, Noah, I shook his hand and petted his shoulder. He grabbed my arm and flipped it around and almost snapped it. Needless to say, it was the most awkward situation in my life, and even thinking about it makes me grind my teeth. I learned that Noah had been in Afghanistan and he freaked out when something or someone touched him from his back. It might have been post-traumatic stress disorder, or he was just hypervigilant. Don't forget that hypervigilance is necessary to keep one alive in conflict. The saddest thing is the high number of servicemen who are returning from war with these sort of mental problems. At least now they recognize PTSD as a real problem, so better debriefing can occur when servicemen return, or early intervention support can be provided, unlike the Vietnam vets who had to suffer in silence for decades. But unfortunately, the soldiers still aren't receiving the level of help that they need to deal with these sorts of issues. When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell to turn on notifications. Put the playlist on in the background to finish listening to all the stories, or if you want some vibey music to put on in the background, check out easymode. If you like Am I the Genius, give Am I the Jerk a shot. Everything linked in the description.